Hello and welcome to the Lewis Carroll Society of North America's very special presentation of Carroll en Français. And today we have not one, but two fabulous presenters here. The dynamic duo of Justine Houyaux and Douglas Kibbee are here to entertain and enlighten you. Now, don't worry if you do not know French. It will soon become evident that your host does not either. But don't worry, this presentation is for everybody. It's about the challenges and the history of translating the Alice books with all their wordplay and nonsense into French. So I'm really looking forward to this. They are both going to talk for about a half hour, so a little longer than some of our presentations. So make sure you're comfy, get a snack going. And by the way, my name's Heather. I'm your host for today, and I'm also the vice president of the Lewis Carroll Society of North America, and I get to plan and host these events with the help of my trusty committee, the senior common room curators. So welcome, and we're going to dive right in today because we've got a lot of information to take in. I know a lot of people have really been looking forward to this event, so I'm going to dive right in and introduce our first speaker. Justine Houyaux is a PhD student at the Interdisciplinary Center for Translation and Interpreting Studies at ULege, Belgium, whose work focuses on the cultural elements in the French translations of Alice. And I'm sure that wasn't at all obvious that I was reading that off the screen. That just flowed out of me very naturally. Welcome, Justine. Go ahead and unmute yourself and say hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for being here today. And you know what? I didn't even tell people what you're going to talk about. Surrealice-Adjacent, 3 French translators of Carroll in the interwar period. So, are you ready to get going?
I am. Let's go.
All right. I will make myself scarce and I'll see you in about a half hour.
All right. Dear friends, dear colleagues, esteemed members of the Lewis Carroll Society of North America, and all of you who have made the decision to join us today, thank you for having me here today, and thank you, Heather, for organizing this wonderful event. The elements, they're research notes, really, that I'm going to present to you today are a composite of the research I've done for multiple papers, chapters in a book, and it is my pleasure to finally be able to put all that together today. As most translation study scholars who work on Carroll will tell you if you ask them, and often if you don't, coming up with a definitive list of his translated works in French or otherwise is a Sisyphean task over which we can only exert ourselves thanks to a rather deluded approach. For example, between 2012 and 2014, Professor Nia Chevrel, Professor Collier Whiteside, and yours truly took a crack at compiling a complete list of the French translations of Alice in Wonderland for John Linsett and Alan Tannenbaum's behemoth tour de force, with which I'm sure many of you are familiar, Alice in a World of Wonderlands, published in 2015. We overtook that task of listing every French Alice ever published with academic rigor, exhausting ourselves over the catalogues of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, as well as those of many smaller private collections and local branches of public libraries all over the French-speaking world. We tried, but 2 things were for certain from the get-go. 1, the list would be rendered obsolete the minute the volume was published, as there's always a new Alice. And even right now, as I'm talking to you, I'm positive that at least 2 new French Alices are about to be released. And 2, we were definitely missing out on some editions. Professor Kibbee will, I'm sure, agree with me on this. If you collect the French Alices, you can be sure of one thing. The instant you call it a day satisfied with your list of translators, you will find yourself at the nearest flea market, where you will inevitably find another Alice published 50 years ago by an obscure press, together with some never-seen-before illustrations, and with a translator nobody remembers and of whom you've clearly never heard. Such is the fate of the collector of French Caroliana. It is a losing game, but I'll be damned if I don't play it anyway. By the way, as a side note, you can check out my consistently failed attempts at updating the list by scanning the QR code here on this slide. I'll show it again later if you want. So Alice as a surrealist object is a concept that was first introduced to French scholars over 35 years ago by Isabelle Nière-Chevrel, who was the first French researcher to attempt an extensive survey of the reception of Carroll in France, and all subsequent research stands on her shoulders. My approach thus far has consisted in trying to uncover new, overlooked, or otherwise forgotten primary sources that sustain that claim. And I've been lucky because I started to do just that at the precise moment when there was a renewed interest for the surrealists in France, with a new array of publications and some very interesting exhibitions, the most detailed of which took place at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in 2021. It must have been in the zeitgeist, really. Another thing I need to cover here, and I promise that it will be my last venture into translation studies theory for today, is prosopography. Stone describes prosopography as the investigation of the common background characteristics of a group of actors in history by means of a collective study of their lives. Simply put and applied to translation studies, it means looking into translators' biographies in order to find what they have in common and how they differ. Susan Peckford makes the point that the historical approaches, the historical approach constitutes a turn in translation studies, which is fascinating to me because the field has so far concerned itself with the what, the why, the how much, the when of translations without being much preoccupied with who actually wrote those translations, as if texts were conjured up from the ether. It is not a coincidence that this turn is occurring in the same time frame as reflections on the translator's invisibility, the emergence of the hashtag Name the Translator on social media, and high-profile cases such as Yiling Wang v. the British Museum. Translators, it seems, are finally being seen. It is only fair that we should try to reassess the history of translation through the history of its professionals, among whom the translators of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland occupy prime real estate. To that effect, and before we get to the surrealists, we need, of course, to mention Henry Buet. Claude Romney's 1981 seminal article, The First French Translator of Alice, Henry Buet, in Jabberwocky number 48, remains to this day the starting point of any research into Buet, which can now be augmented with a few biographical details thanks to the worldwide effort to digitize old newspapers and personal archives. I'll only mention Buet here in passing as the first person ever to translate Alice, and under the impulse and supervision of Dodson himself. But should you have any questions about him, Doug and I will try our best to answer them after our presentations. Translations, among many other things, and as painful as it is for the translator to admit it, are commodities. And like most commodities, they obey the laws of the market in that they have to meet some sort of demand. No one beside Dodson seemed to wish for a first French translation of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. In the course of my own research in the Hachette archive, so the publisher, I found very little in the contract ledger beside a short handwritten note stating that Alice had been put on sale in 1870. And that was it, which goes to show that you cannot force a translation upon an audience who hasn't asked for it. After Buet came the anonymous translators. In the period between Buet's translation in 1930 and 1931, which argue were the years of a real turning point for Carroll in France, the status of the French editions of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was rather dire. In total, only one translation had been produced, and it was an anonymous work whose author's identity will probably forever remain a mystery. It is my personal opinion that the anonymous 1908 translator was Jeanne Loiseau, who translated Byron's complete works, as the copy held at the BNF bears a note from the publisher addressed to Daniel Le Sueur, which was Loiseau's nom de plume. But of course, I don't believe I'll ever be able to prove that. Note that Alice's journey in France is peppered with anonymous contributions well into the 1990s. The translators we do know, however, surrounding those two pivotal years were very interesting people. The first, and by far the most famous, was Louis Aragon. Nancy Cunard had relocated to Paris in 1920 after separating from her husband she had married 4 years earlier. Officially, Louis Aragon and Nancy Cunard met in the early days of 1926. In February of the same year, for their first trip together, they went to London. Of this budding romance in the British capital, Aragon would later write a poem titled Le mot amour, the word love, which heavily references Lewis Carroll and Alice. Fast forward to 1928. Why Aragon decided to translate The Hunting of the Snark is a little blurry. It is not guaranteed that a deeper exploration of either Aragon or Cunard's archive would inform us any further. What is certain, however, is that the text had not been requested or commissioned by anyone. Snark was Aragon's suddenly voiced choice, wrote Cunard, though she could not remember the exact circumstances that led him to choose this particular text. This subverts the process of translation entirely. How often can a translator really choose their next task on their own without being asked to translate this or that by their publisher? Nancy Cunard voiced some concerns. Yes, Aragon's knowledge of English was good enough, and he certainly could write in French, but would he be able to transfer the spirit of the text, which with its purely English humor, as she said, into another language? You'll see what I shall make of this translation, said Aragon. I can hear it already in my head. And so he did translate the text, which was then printed on Cunard's own printing press and put on the market in 1929. The case had been made successfully that the dual reading of Alice as both books for children and books for adults in France is largely due to the surrealist introduction of Carroll to the general public. In many aspects, the Snark reduces this duality in that it is almost completely diverted from its younger audience, while being quasi-exclusively regarded as a work that pertains to the surrealist realm. More often than not, La Chasse aux Snark remains the privilege of the connoisseurs of Carroll and those who do know of and appreciate the surrealist and surrealist-adjacent translators of his work. The Snark, which once was the focus of the attention of the most prominent surrealists, and semi-indirectly created this French double reading and double audience of Carroll, as well as granted him a position on the list of great authors, still remains much less popular than the Alice books in France. As for Aragon, he wasn't done with Carroll just yet. In 1931, he wrote a paper for the surrealist journal Le Surréalisme au service de la Révolution, in which he compared two new French translations of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, one of which we'll discuss in a moment. What is remarkable with this paper, Lewis Carroll in 1931, is that it already foreshadows most of what Carroll's French trajectory would be. In the article, Aragon calls for a critical edition with notes and a bibliography, a call that was soon answered by serious scholars, such as Jean Gattegno, whose extensive scholarship of Carroll culminated with the ultimate accolade in 1990, La Bibliothèque de la Pléiade, the prestigious leather-bound collection dedicated a volume to the works of Carroll. Jacques Papy's 1961 scholarly translation was the first to present the text with erudite footnotes. Laurent Bury's in 2009 is the latest. The article, which you can see on this slide, further intellectualizes Carroll's works, and it marks a real understanding of what would become of Carroll's French legacy. After that, Aragon abandoned Carroll entirely, but many other surrealists took over, which leads me to our second translator. Marie-Madeleine Fayet, a 30-something from Brittany, had, up until the late 1920s, focused on translating religious texts. Her private correspondence is full of witty quips and puns and peppered with the names of her friends, amongst whom Antoine de Saint-Exupéry and Sylvia Beach. In an exchange with her publisher, Georges Cresse, she notes, "I've barely had time to catch my breath upon returning to Brest, and you already want to know what the second part of Alice has in store for us. What it has in store will certainly be enough to enrage me, and by the time I'm done with it, I'll either be in Charenton." Charenton was a psychiatric asylum near Paris, "or I'll have become an amateur surrealist. And by the way, what's the difference between the two?" So she makes it clear that she doesn't define herself as a surrealist, and yet it is her translation, which 2 years later is going to catch Aragon's attention enough for him to write a paper. Fayet works fast and with grace. Her translation is ready by the end of 1929, but unfortunately the illustrator, Jean E, is busy dodging the editor's calls and in a series of increasingly more comical events, even pretends to be bedridden in order not to deliver the illustrations. He eventually does, and they're marvelous. Marie-Madeleine Fayet went on to translate books for children and adults alike, and she becomes the first French translator of Carson McCullers. For some reason, she also decides to become a nurse at some point, which comes in handy when Germany invades France. She then joins 2 resistance networks with whom she hides and exfiltrates Allied pilots, which grants her 2 medals and honors at the end of the war. In her second act, she works at the Reconstruction Ministry and as a member of the Child Protection Court. She dies in 1963 at the age of 70. The combined volume of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass has become a bit of a collector's item, which, when it is found at all, can be rather expensive. The translation in itself, often overlooked nowadays, is often overlooked nowadays. It is a classical example of what Alice sounds like in French, with a text that is fairly similar to the original, while substituting some cultural elements with French cultural elements in order to facilitate the reader's comprehension, and some word plays and puns being ignored or deleted, as it was common at the time. What really sets it apart is that, combined with Buet's translation, it excludes the French Alice from the retranslation hypothesis paradigm, which states that a first translation of a text is always more domesticating or more adapted to the target audience than the subsequent retranslations. Buet's translation is far more foreignizing than Fayet's, which, coupled with Buet's first translation's editorial trajectory, de facto makes Fayet's translation the first real French translation of Alice, with an actual French audience in mind and prompted by a French publisher. Our third translator is René Bour. René Bour was, until fairly recently, a mystery wrapped in enigma. We knew very little of the artist, apart from the fact that he died roughly at the age of 25. Now, note that I'm saying artist and not translator, because René Bour was both. And this is not me throwing shade at translators who claim that translation is an art. It is a factual statement that René Bour was a talented painter and cartoonist who was classically trained at École des Beaux-Arts de Paris. Bour's originality lays with his quasi-unilinear drawings, where he does, in fact, lift the pen from the page, which is reminiscent of other artists of his time, such as Picasso, Cocteau, or Alexander Calder. Point of interest, Bour is the only illustrator, to my knowledge, ever to show Alice's imaginings on the page. In this example of the little girl wondering if she shall fall right through the earth, he is representing the idea within the idea, the dream within the dream, which I believe is truly original. Bour also has a few interesting takes on the text itself, which with translation strategies never seen before or after within the history of the French translations of Alice. For example, he translates the caucus race in chapter 3 as course à la cocoasu, a term he borrows from an Algonquin language via an 1872 memoirs by Trumbull. He otherwise does a solid job of transferring the puns and jokes throughout the text. The translation, together with its illustrations, was printed in 1937, 3 years after René Bour's death due to illness during his mandatory military service. There are, of course, other French translations of Carroll's works in the interwar period that are as deserving of our attention as the three we have looked at today. As a whole, those three translators come from different walks of life, with the anecdotal common point that they all were to spend some time with the military, tragically for one of them. But it is easily explained by historical circumstances. It is the interwar period. Interestingly, two of the texts, Fayet and Bour, were made possible thanks to traditionally Catholic publishing houses sorry, that used to focus on religious edification of children, and which were at the end of the day in the business of children's books, and won by a small one-woman printing operation in the case of the Aragon Cunard's venture. Bour's translation is canonically the first French translation of Alice, marketed specifically to adults and occurring just a little over 5 years after Aragon's call for serious readings of Carroll. So there's a couple more things I would like to show you. So this graph, which some of you might already have seen, so in lieu of conclusion, I would like to discuss this. So throughout this talk and my general approach to the history of the translations of Alice in the interwar period and beyond, I do talk about surrealist translators. And when I talk about those people, the people I'm talking about are the people whose names are represented in pink on the graph. So the graph is still a work in progress because more links surface basically every time I open a new archive. So it might look completely different in a year from now. But those translators in pink and their documented relationships with the surrealists are shown with the pink chords, and the surrealists themselves are shown in green, surrealist-adjacent authors in blue, and the publishers whose main activity revolved around surrealist writing at the time in black. Those translators are the people who frequented Aragon, Breton, and the rest of the surrealist circle. The people who were there for the automatic writing experiments, whose personal correspondence and archive document a buzzing social and intellectual life with the same people who invented, advanced, and defined surrealism. Perhaps, when you look at all this, perhaps Aragon was right all along. Perhaps, after all, Lewis Carroll really was a proto-surrealist, and the reason why he's still regarded as one today is not because Breton, Aragon, Ernst, and others decided that he was one, but because it is the natural category, if there is such a thing, of course, in which Carroll was always supposed to fall. And because I haven't gone over time, I can show you a couple of bonuses to this.
Yeah, so please take your time. You have a full 5 minutes, I would say. Don't worry.
Oh, good. That's perfect. I don't need more than that. So this this small camembert like graph that you can see here really shows the surrealist influence on Carroll's French trajectory. So, because even today, when you read a new Alice book in French, the chances are that you're in fact reading a translation by a surrealist are very, very high. In fact, according to the quick math I did based on the BNF catalog, out of the 54 reprints and new edition that used existing translations between 2000 and 2021, 51.9% used translations that had been written by André B, Jacques Papy, or Henri Parisot, who were regulars of the surrealist circles, which is more than all other reused translations combined. The factors to this are multiple. One that stands out is, of course, the publishing house's intellectual property ownership of those translations. This economic factor plays an important role in that a translation that was already paid for many years ago is a lucrative text to reuse and to resell to other publishing houses. That being said, it also has to do with the remarkable quality of those translations, whose enduring presence on the market is symptomatic of an enduring love affair that the public has not only with the Alice books, but also with the mark of the surrealists on the French text. And my second bonus here is this picture, on which you can see Henri Parisot, who translated Alice in 1968 and then proceeded to translate pretty much everything Carroll had written. And here you can see him listening to Gisèle Prassino, who illustrated Guy Trédé's translation of Alice, reading her experiments in automatic writing to a group of surrealists, among whom you'll recognize André Breton, Paul Éluard, and René Bour, for example. And that's it from me.
Thank you so much, Justine. Thank you so much for sharing all that new information. First of all, your new research there. And I'm sorry, I got distracted because I saw a question just came in. We're just going to, we'll leave that for the joint Q&A. I think that'll be fun for you and Doug to answer it together. I found it so interesting when you said that René Bour, he drew the imaginings of Alice. And I've heard so many illustrators and artists say that they were very intimidated to illustrate Alice because everyone's done it before. How can you possibly think of something new? But the text is so richly layered. I feel like there's always something new to find. I mean, I know it's been done by more than one person, but I'm always thrilled to see Elsie and Lacey and Tilly at the bottom of the well. If someone bothers to illustrate that, or Twinkle Twinkle Little Bat. Were there any other examples of René Bour that besides the falling through the center of the earth? That you can think of to hand that
Well, he did the girls at the bottom of the well.
Oh, he did. Great.
I just here. Oh, hang on, I need to I don't know how to do this.
A little out of focus, but we get the general idea. Yeah. Actually, maybe I can find it online and drop it into the chat later, but that's great.
I send it to you.
Thank you. I would appreciate that. Yeah, and thank you so much. So we're going to move on to Professor Kibbee now, but then we are going to bring you back a little later and have a joint Q&A. So Doug, if you would like to unmute and start your video. And let me introduce our next speaker. Douglas Kibbee is Professor Emeritus of French Linguistics at the University of Illinois. And over the years, he has created a corpus of the 51 translations of Alice, organized sentence by sentence. And he's going to choose one of those sentences today to talk to us about. And I am actually going to run Doug's slideshow. So it's just going to take me one moment to pull it up here and get everything looking perfect. Doug, say hello to your adoring fans.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Heather, for giving me this opportunity. And thanks to the Lewis Carroll Society for creating this platform. Thanks to Justine who really has broadened my perspective on all the translators. I knew their text, but I didn't know all their background. So it's a pleasure to make these connections. and learn much more about the people I've been studying.
A team effort. Excellent.
Yes, a team effort, very much so.
All right. So are you seeing your slideshow full screen?
I do. I see it here.
All right. I am going to mute myself and stop video. If you need anything, let me know. But otherwise, I will be here advancing your slides.
Okay, very good. If Alice is untranslatable, as many have claimed, the French certainly didn't get the memo. There are at least 50 full translations of the text, ranging from Henri Buet in 1869 to Clémentine Vachery's in 2022, and I'm sure more are on the way. To this, we can add the mysterious Professor A's 2015 translation of Alice's Adventures Underground, the manuscript version of Alice. The first translation was done under Lewis Carroll's direct supervision. The other translators were on their own. Today, I'm not going to judge the success or failure of different translations, tempting as that may be, but rather I will try to see what each translation tells us about how Alice herself was perceived by the translators. Often translation is viewed as a loss. No translator can capture all the nuances of the original. But translations can also be viewed as a gain, adding interpretations the original author didn't think of. So let's look at 51 Alices as seen from the translation of a single sentence. Today, we're going to look at one of the most famous lines in the Alice text. If translating the standard English sentences of Lewis Carroll is tricky enough, translating deliberately incorrect sentences is even more difficulter. So, curiouser and curiouser, cried Alice. She was so much surprised that for the moment, she quite forgot how to speak good English. As we shall see, the incorrect comparative of the opening exclamation is only one of the clues to how the translators perceived our heroine, but it's a good start. So let's set the stage for this exclamation. In chapter 1, Alice experienced a wild change in the form of her body, drinking from a bottle marked "Drink Me" and shrinking. Then she ate the cake marked "Eat Me," and as chapter 2 opens, she is growing up to more than 9 feet tall. In her astonishment, this well-educated daughter of an Oxford don makes an incorrect comparison. In English, 1- and 2-syllable adjectives form their comparatives by adding the ER suffix, fast, faster, happy, happier. These are designated as synthetic comparatives, as the comparative indicator is part of the word. 3-syllable adjectives like curious, curious, must use a separate word, more, to form the comparative. Curious, more curious, a construction known as an analytic comparative. Another feature of the exclamation is the "and" that joins the two comparative forms, curiouser and curiouser. This structure indicates a progression from one level of curiosity to another. The standard French structure for such a progression is de plus en plus, plus the adjective, literally from more to more. In this instance, the grammatically correct translation would be de plus en plus curieux. The first choice for the translator is to decide whether to use correct French or not. The simplest solution is to ignore the mistake in the first part of the sentence, to pretend that Alice's exclamation was perfectly grammatical. This fits with her education, but it makes the second part of the sentence, she quite forgot how to speak good English, illogical. Not that Lewis Carroll had anything against a lack of logic, but this solution underlines Alice's very correct education. 7 translators use the perfectly grammatical in French, de plus en plus curieux, or in one translation, de plus en plus épatant. 6 of these 7 translators date from 1940 or before, more than half of the translations before that date, injecting a notion of chronological change in translators' preferences. Four of them, Fayet, Arnaud, Houyaux, and Minot, then omit the second half of the sentence. If there is no error, Alice cannot be charged with forgetting how to speak well. Nothing illogical about that. For the anonymous translator of 1908, it was not so illogical. According to that translator, the choice of the adjective épatant was against les usages de la bonne langue, the usage of proper language. We'll return to the choice of adjective later. Two others, Durand and Durand-Perrol, use the same structure, but include the part about speaking ungrammatically. Nothing logical about that. So 7 translators down, 44 to go. Two others choose different, but still perfectly grammatical solutions. Comme c'est étrange, how strange it is, in the anonymous translation of 1940. It certainly is, but the lack of comparison eliminates the notion of progression, of Alice's mental state changing just as her physical state does. The outlier amongst those who make no error is Jacques Massiveau, who opts for de mieux en mieux, better and better, omitting the adjective in the original and introducing a new idea. It is Alice's change in size for better or for worse. Growing taller enables Alice to get the key to the small door, but also makes it impossible to get through the small door leading to the beautiful garden. In this rendition, Alice is not mystified by the sudden change in her size, but rather happy for it. Another alternative is to make a mistake by doubling the comparatives. More very plus adjective, more worse, more better. As in the case of the grammatical solutions, the comparison can retain the adjective curious, or the mistake can be in the form of the synthetic comparatives. 3 translators choose to combine the adverbs très, very, or tellement, so much, or to such an extent, and the comparative plus, more, along with the adjective curieux. De plus très curieux en plus très curieux. Buet worked under the watchful eye of Dodgson himself. The hyphenated form combining very with the adjective très curieux is an antiquated form that, by 1869, had been out of use for more than a century. The Alice that Charles Dodgson knew, the Alice whose father was a distinguished scholar of Greek and a clergyman who would have known the King James Version of the Bible, might have been exposed to the archaic forms captured here by the translator. Other double comparatives also combine more and very, or to such an extent. De plus en plus très curieux, de plus en plus tellement curieux. In all of these, the degree of curiosity is established, and then the progression of that degree is expressed. The change in size arouses more and more a state of heightened curiosity. Another option is to omit the adjective and, like the Massiveau example mentioned earlier, to make a value judgment about the change in size. Like English, French has an irregular comparative for the adjectives good and bad, while the standard means of expressing a comparative requires the combination of more and the adjective. So you have bon and the irregular mieux or meilleur, mauvais and the irregular pire, or tort, but the irregular would be fort and plus fort. Combining plus in one of the irregular comparators is therefore an error, but not a common one. The grammatical mistake is considerably less likely than the overgeneralization of the ER ending in the original English. 2 see the change for the better, while 6 translators opt for the worse. And 1 combines better and worse. The negative interpretation foreshadows Alice's sad realization that her new size has a downside, the inability to get through the small door, while the positive perspective signals her excitement at the prospect of getting the key before the disillusionment of being unable to reach the magnificent garden. De plus en plus mieux, de plus en plus pire. De plus en plus and de mieux en mieux are standard structures. The error comes in combining them with another comparative. 3 other translators mimic the structure. De pire en pire, from worse to worse in Rouen, or de meilleur en meilleur, from better to better in Trédé, or de mieux en pire, from better to worse in Le Dain. De pire en pire is not impossible, but is extremely rare, 3 occurrences over the history of all French literature, the most recent dating to 1885. In the Trésor de la langue française dictionary, it is described as a possible substitute for peace in lower class speech. The other 2 are unattested in the Frontex database and in the dictionary. Prédé substitutes the comparative adjective meilleur for the comparative adverb mieux required in standard French, while Le Dain combines the positive and negative in an illogical structure similar to Métrage. These translations omit the adjective curious. Alice's perception of the change in shape is adjudged better or worse according to the translator's interpretation of Alice's reaction. Another group of translators maintained the adjective curious in a variety of erroneous structures. Robert and André Prophétie provided the most literal translation, linking the 2 comparatives with the conjunction and, a rare structure in modern French with only 10 attestations since 1800. Plus et plus curieux. Ramée used the standard French comparative structure of de et and en, but substituted très, very for plus, more. De très en très curieux. Almost 20 years later, Flandre combined very and more, de très en plus curieux. These translations retain the progressive aspect of the original as Alice's bewilderment grows with each change in size. One of the most recent translations by Salsa uses the adverb beaucoup. C'est beaucoup curieux. It's much curious. Laporte doubles the more than without the progressive structure, plus que curieux. Word order plays a role in several other translations. These are not necessarily erroneous, but the odd word order is jarring. Bismuth places the standard comparative structure after the adjective, emphasizing the curious nature of the situation, and then the progressive aspect. C'est curieux de plus en plus. The 2 most recent translations from 2021 and 2022 use almost identical constructions, duplicating the adjective along with the comparative. C'est de plus curieux en plus curieux, or de plus curieux en plus curieux. The standard language would require either très, very, or the addition of plus, beaucoup plus curieux, much more curious. This translation signals a single state, not a progression. Merrill expanded Alice's exclamation, foregrounding the curiousness of then adding foregrounding the curiousness of the situation, and then adding an awkward comparison to demonstrate the effect the surprise has had on Alice's language. Au curieux, c'est curieux, tant et tant plus. The level of curiosity builds as Alice moves from recognition of the curious nature of her situation to a firm statement, and then the explosive expression of surprise, so much and so much more. The last 2 we shall consider in this section replace curious with bizarre and rely on another deformation of the comparative structure. We'll return later to the substitution of bizarre for curious. De plus en pire bizarre, from more to worse bizarre. Plus que c'est bizarre et plus que c'est bizarre, more that it's bizarre and more that it's bizarre. The first by Houyaux has the progressive structure de en and introduces a mistake using the synthetic comparative pia after the analytic comparative plus. In addition to, in using pia, Houyaux joins other translators in judging the change to be for the worse. The use of a and in the translation by the De Jong team matches the progressive structure used by Carroll, though, as noted earlier, concerning the Prophéties translation, it is rarely used in French. Another solution is a new word. As we have seen, some translators correct Alice's grammar, while others have altered in one way or another standard French comparative structures. But 8 translators tried another tack, inventing a new word to express Alice's astonishment. 2 translators invent new words by adding a negative suffix or to an existing word. Bour's bizarrerie takes the standard form bizarre and adds an ending, rie, that typically indicates a demeaning twist on the original word. For instance, avocat, avocasserie, lawyer, and then avocasserie, stupid lawyer tricks. Or Peter's drolasse uses a different pejorative suffix, asse, as in blonde hair or blonde woman, and blondasse, dirty blonde hair or a blonde bimbo. Attaching it to a word that means funny or humorous. The translation of Professor A adds the suffix ant, rendering, bizarrant, bizarre, which gives agency to this phenomenon. Rendering bizarre. Alice seems more confused or perplexed by what is happening. Another invented word, the schwa's menofen, switches the syllable initial letters of phenomenon, thus introducing an error. In the singular, there is just one phenomenon, not a progression of one curious phenomenon growing smaller to another growing larger. De Grey uses the normal comparative structure, but introduces an error by replacing the adjective bizarre by a paronym, bazar, a word whose pronunciation is close to that of the intended word. De plus en plus bazar, more and more bazar. The choice of bazar, a marketplace of many small shops in labyrinthine streets, reflects Alice's confusion. Bazar is of Persian origin and usually refers to such markets in Asia and Africa, adding an element of exoticism to Alice's perspective. Another solution is to make mistakes in pronunciation. Several translators, all maintaining the progressive element of the French comparative structure, changed the mistaken grammar to faulty pronunciation. 3 altered the liaison consonant in the comparison. In the standard French comparative structure, de plus en plus, the S of the first plus is pronounced as Z, while this S of the second would be silent before an initial consonant of curieux, or of bizarre for that matter. 2 translators substitute T for S. De plus en plus curieux, or de plus en plus curieux. The liaison T is quite frequent in French as a means of avoiding hiatus of 2 vowels, usually between the verb and a following pronoun. Va-t-il, dit-elle, trouve-t-on, for instance. The mistake introduced by these 2 translators mirrors the overgeneralization of a standard French form, the comparative in ER, in Carroll's sentence. A 3rd translator inserts 2 pronunciation mistakes as she reduces the comparative structure to a single word with the liaison R for the first S and a pronounced S for the second one, de plus en plus bizarre. Two other translators retain the standard comparative structure, but deform the pronunciation of the adjective. De plus en plus curieux, or de plus en plus curieuse. Sueur has modified the French word to give it a pronunciation close to that of the English original, curious, curieuse. In these instances, forgetting to speak well for Alice is a physical confusion, a slip of the tongue. Rather than a double comparison, Saint-Ouen opts for a triple quantifier. Étrange, et si tant tellement étrange. La Femme and Bury create unusual word combinations. La Femme uses the adverb derived from strange in conjunction with the adjective strange, a duplication that indicates a state. Étrangement étrange. Bury translates curious by not normal, perhaps the lowest level of curiosity, compared with bizarre and strange. Finally, some translators replaced a grammatical mistake by an error in register, using words that indicate familiar or uneducated speech. The anonymous translator of 1947 reduces the adverb bien to the popular form ba and combines it with the interjection ça alors, which expresses surprise and incredulity. Ah ben ça alors. Gaucheron uses the standard comparative progression and then adds an interrogative structure that reflects rural or archaic language. De plus en plus curieux, c'est-il pas vrai? It's the type of construction Alice could have picked up from a maid. Finally, Valérie doesn't translate the sentence at all. So to summarize, three aspects of the translation of Alice's exclamation stand out. The translation or not of the adjective curious, the maintenance or absence of a progression from one state to another, and the choice of errors in the language of the young daughter of a distinguished scholar. Curious, as we have seen, the translators use a variety of words to express curious. Those 17 don't translate it at all. Those 17 use some form of the comparative structure along with a value judgment, a change for the better or worse. For those who do translate curious, the most obvious choice is the cognate word curieux, expressing, as does the English, something that arouses one's interest. Almost half of the translators choose this equivalence. It implies an active response to something unusual, an impulse to explore further, to follow one's curiosity. 10 others try different solutions, none of which convey that impulse. 6 opt for bizarre, or some deformation of that word. Bizarre signifies something hard to understand because of its unusual nature, something more unusual than what curieux signifies. Étrange is the choice of 3 translators, something surprising because it is unusual. Derived from the Latin extraneous, it connotes foreignness. Only the anonymous translator of 1908 uses épatant, an adjective that first occurs in the 1860s, derived from the verb épater, which in its figurative use means to surprise someone to such an extent that they fall over backward. Its frequency in Feydeau's farces early in the 20th century, sometimes with popular constructions like stépatant, is indicative of its use by uneducated speakers, though it also shows up a few times in Proust. It means astonishing or amazing in a good way, thus a positive interpretation of Alice's changes in size. Finally, Bury combines the comparative structure with pas normal, not normal, abnormal. Of all the options, this is the least strong expression of difference, of unusualness. Through these word choices, we see a spectrum of levels of surprise, from omission of the adjective indicating less surprise than a judgment, to the weak surprise of not normal, to the very strong surprise of bizarre. As for progression, how does Alice perceive her second change in size? At the point of her exclamation, Alice has undergone 2 changes in size, shorter after drinking from the bottle and taller after eating cake. The construction linking the same adjective by and signals a progression. What was curious, the first transformation, has become even more curious with the second transformation. One group of translators changed the nature of the progression, introducing a value judgment from bad to worse, or better and better. Others maintained the progression with an adjective, sometimes curious, sometimes another near synonym. Still others abandoned the progression, making a simple statement of surprise, sometimes creating a new word to express that surprise. Now we come to the question of mistaken English. The second half of the sentence introduces the narrator's evaluation of Alice's cry of surprise. She quite forgot how to speak good English. The original comparison, curiouser and curiouser, is an overgeneralization of the rules for creating comparatives in French. In English, a common mistake for young people still learning their native language. This type of error is introduced by the translators, might be grammatical, an incorrect comparison, lexical, a unknown or unbecoming word, or a matter of uttering an expression more common to a scullery maid than to the educated daughter of an Oxford scholar. Each choice of a mistake presents us with a slightly different image of who Alice is, a young pupil still struggling with regular and irregular constructions, a creative girl inventing a new word or structure, an upper-class girl shocked into using a lower-class version of the language. What does constitute good English, and how do the translators approach this linguistic judgment? The variety of solutions is another instance in which the translators offer different interpretations of who Alice is. The first decision made by the translators is the nationality of Alice. Is she English, French, or is it simply unknown? If the translators avoid the question here, they will soon have to decide the question when Alice tries to determine what language is best for communicating with the mouse after she's fallen into the pool of her own tears. Is it a French mouse come over with William the Conqueror, in which case Alice is English, or an English mouse come over with the Black Prince? Only one translator makes her firmly English. Parlez correctement anglais. In Laporte's translation. 5 others make her firmly French. She forgets to express herself in good French. Or she forgot her good French. Or she forgot the language, the rules of current French. 2 substitute Latin for French, but it's not a reference to the language of ancient Rome. Elle en perdait son latin. En perdre son latin in these translations is an idiomatic expression meaning she no longer knew what to do, or simply she was confused. The most common judgment of Alice's language is that she forgot to speak as one should. 23 of the translators use the adverb correctement, correctly. This might simply mean grammatically, or as one should, emphasizing the social aspect of linguistic norms. The social aspect is addressed more directly in a few translations, as we shall see. So some explicitly invoke grammar. 2 of these assume she has the fundamental grammar knowledge of a native speaker, but she almost forgot her language in Urie's translation. She forgot temporarily the most basic grammar in Ledin's translation. 2 others mention rules she has learned through her education, emphasizing the upper-class upbringing she has enjoyed. She completely forgot to speak according to the rules of grammar. Or astonishment made her forget the teachings of the grammar. Almost half, 23 of the 50 translations, equate good English with correctly. 2 of these use the verb s'exprimer to express herself, emphasizing communication to make herself understood, but she is speaking to herself. Correctly itself underscores the social aspect of language. Who determines correctness? In general, language standards are invented and imposed by educated speakers of the upper classes. The quality of her language, judged from social standards, is prominent in some of the other translations. She forgot to speak well, oublié de bien parler. Or she forgot the common practices of good language. Or she forgot to speak as one should. In most of the translations, as in the original English, Alice knows how to speak according to the expectations of her class, but has forgotten to do so. But Buet, the original translator who worked with Lewis Carroll, stresses inability. She was unable to express herself correctly. Next, orthography is another option. One translator makes the grammatical error a spelling error, which seems an odd choice since it's an exclamation may allow. De plus en plus mieux. And as we have noted, several translators represent Alice's mistake by using a mistaken word. Two of these reference this type of error in the second half of the sentence. She used a word that did not exist, or she used the wrong word. So, to conclude, is translation necessarily a loss of meaning? The Italian equivalence, tradutore, traditore, the translator as traitor to the original, the translation as a betrayal, would have us believe so. But do we consider Yo-Yo Ma's and Rostropovich's interpretations of Bach's cello suites as betrayals of Bach? Each translation will match perfectly the original's presentation, but many more will make explicit some things only hinted at in the original, or even absent in the original. This is not a loss, but a gain, a new insight into all the varieties of art humanity. Why does Alice need 51 translations into French? Because what makes Alice in Wonderland special is that through its quirkiness, it opens our minds to our uncertainty. It inspires our curiosity, making us curiouser and curiouser. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Doug. I hope we have some great questions here and that everyone behaved themselves in the chat, because I was taking my slide forwarding responsibilities very seriously. So I was not looking at the chat or questions or anything. Doug, did you say 17 translations that you've come across just didn't translate curiouser and curiouser at all?
I think I'm trying to remember, let me double check my notes here. There were some that didn't translate. Well, let me go back through my notes here.
I mean, honestly,
yeah,
one is too many. I feel like, how can you have the book
no, I don't
without
think it
that
was that
iconic
many.
phrase?
Okay. But I can't find the note right now.
No problem.
But there were several that did omit that and went straight to the speaking incorrectly, or there were others that because they used the curiouser and curious, they translated it correctly, they couldn't continue with the second half of the sentence, or they shouldn't have. Right. Some of them did anyway. So.
Good point. And also, I'm wondering, if I said to you, Doug, you need to come back next month and give us 51 versions of a different sentence, what would be your second choice for giving a presentation, knowing that you've gone through sentence by sentence of the entire book?
Yeah. Boy, that's a tough question.
I asked the hardballs.
Yeah. I have to think about that. There's so many strange things that she says that where particularly where Lewis Carroll is taking a very uh, literal reading of some idiomatic expression that I think are the most interesting things, because it challenges the translator in ways that have to be addressed, or if the translator gives up, don't get addressed. One of the uh, when we get to the uh, series of puns later in the book, where there's one after another with the mock turtle, and some translators just omit the whole chapter.
It's one
They just
solution.
give up. But so that's less interesting. And frankly, most few try to match all the puns. It's just impossible, I think. Uh, so, uh, but there's quite a variety of how they approach things, certainly.
And Justine, please come back. You appeared for a moment, but yeah, unmute and just be ready to jump in whenever you can. Actually, and I wanted to tell everybody, so during the Alice 150 celebration in New York City in 2015, we had a whole week at the Girlier Club on translations into different languages of the Alice books, and probably Snark too. Unfortunately, I was not there, so I don't remember. But so that was, I believe, that's the last time we've really had a thorough presentation on translations in the Alice books, at least since I've been doing the virtual events since 2020. I don't recall having that. Now, Justine, you had your own conference, right? And that's how you first met Professor Kibbee. Tell us about that a little bit.
So if I recall correctly, Doug, we met in 2017. So that was at a conference organized at my previous university in Mons, Belgium. And that's when Douglas told me about his incredible project of aligning all the French Alices. And it's been 7 years, and I'm sort of used to the concept of him doing that. But from time to time, I'll be doing random things, and I'll just think about what he's doing, in the course of my day. And I still need to pause for 10 seconds to try and compute how immense the task is.
I can't imagine the spreadsheets involved. Yeah, it's amazing.
No. It's true. I mean, I only have the full 51 in for 3 chapters so far, but I fully intend to. For the later chapters, I probably have about 30, and I haven't filled in the others, but I'll get to them.
Plenty of time. So a question, it says it's for Professor Kibbee, but I'm curious to hear from both of you. How did you get access to so many French texts? Did you use a single library or archive, or do you collect them yourself from various sources over a period of time?
I've collected them myself, and I started this project in the early 1990s. I was asked to teach a course in translation, and I was fairly confident judging translations into English about what was possible and what was not possible. But I felt, as a not native speaker of French, I needed to have something more solid to base the judgment of grammaticality and expressive possibilities into French. So I gathered at that point maybe 5 or 6 translations. And then I kept finding more and more and more and more and more and more. So I go through sites like as Justine mentioned, the Bibliothèque Nationale. That's a pretty good source, but it doesn't have everything. Going through the ABE books, the used bookseller online, I will occasionally find things that I was unaware of. Just last year, I came across the Fayot 1947 translation. it wasn't in the Bibliothèque Nationale, and it wasn't anywhere else that I had found until that point. So,
Justine, anything to add? Any secret stashes of French versions that you've found?
Well, my method so far has been fairly chaotic. So my corpus is smaller than Doug's. It's only 28 translations because one of my criteria is that the translation has to be full text. So when you start to have missing bits like ends of chapters and stuff like that, they just don't enter into my corpus, and they have to be first edition. So to me, the problem is mainly related to the fact that they have to be first edition in order for me to avoid problems that would be inherent to publishers making modifications for a new reprint, for example. So I got stuck on two of them for the longest time because they just were impossible to find. So the first one was that I couldn't find was Ramé. So it's in the 19 just let me check to make sure that I'm not saying anything that's inaccurate. Yeah, so Ramé is 1948, and I couldn't find it anywhere. I couldn't get the copy from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. You couldn't buy it anywhere. And finally, I found it in a very, very small public library in a village near Brussels, and I made copies of that one.
What a find. All right, I better get to some more audience questions here. There's going to be a mutiny. There's so many good ones. All right. French, this for either of you. French is a more gendered language than English. How does that impact the translations? Either of you want to weigh in on that?
Definitely impacts it. So one of the most obvious is la souris. The mouse is a feminine word in French. So the mouse has to be a female mouse, let's say, which is not obvious from the. I'm not sure. I can't remember what Carroll himself uses, if he uses male pronoun there for the mouse. But it immediately changes some aspects of the interpretation.
The mouse, a truly underappreciated character, I believe. No, when you say mouse, people automatically think dormouse. I mean, he's the first one Alice sees. He's bilingual, for pity's sake. I mean, it's amazing. All right. We have some questions about the illustrations. Were there specifically French style illustrations that you've come across, or a lot of them, I guess, such as the frog that was shown? Justine, I think that was in yours, right? Some long frog legs, or was that elsewhere?
that is Jean E. So he was a French illustrator specializing in children's books in the late 20s and 1930s for one publisher, so Georges Cresse. That whole collection, so that collection is hang on. I have it here actually. Oh, okay, here it is. It's come on.
Well, this is a good time for me to remind everybody that there is a social hour afterwards. I don't think I've mentioned that. Justine, are you going to be able to attend or no?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Excellent. All right. So Justine will definitely be there. Doug may be there, but he'll be a little late for sure if he's able to come. And I'm just going to drop the link in the chat. That's to the email that contains a social hour link. So you can all open that and join when you can. And go ahead, Justine. Sorry.
So yeah, the collection here is Le Magasin des Demoiselles, and it was part of the children's book catalog. And so they had a series of illustrators that worked only for that publisher, that were French and that worked only for him. So you have Jean in that style. You have, for example, André Noyer, who used to produce watercolors, who illustrated Through the Looking Glass. Well, who did the artwork for the 1931 translation. You have, and he also did superb illustration for Treasure Island, and the book was never published to my knowledge, so it's a shame because they were absolutely beautiful. But one thing that you have to take into account when you mention the illustrations to Alice in Wonderland and also Through the Looking Glass is that a lot of publishers make the choice to use the Tenniel illustrations. So in my corpus, for example, the vast majority of the, I want to say the pre-80s translations, they would go and use the Tenniel illustrations because simply it was cheaper and they're iconic. The readers recognize them immediately. But now you're faced with another phenomenon where they would use, publishers use old translations or translations of which they possess, they own the copyright, and then they will commission a new illustrator, preferably one that's fashionable, in order to sort of patch up an old text and new illustrations, because here the selling point for a lot of collections is actually the illustrations. That's what catches the eye. And if an artist is famous, I mean, I'm thinking of Benjamin Lacombe, for example, whose illustrations are very, very famous and who's very fashionable. So obviously, it was given it was given the 1968 translation to go with his illustration, to go with his illustrations. Yeah.
Yeah. You took the next question right out of my mouth. I was going to say, do you see a lot of Tenniel? And of course you do. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Dana is wondering.
One of the illustrators was an American cartoonist, Edward Cukes, who actually won a Pulitzer Prize for editorial cartoon from the Cleveland Plain Dealer. So
he was used for a French translation.
He was, but it's a puzzling situation where the name given as the translator was a English sounding name, Olive Ray Scott, but the translation is actually the anonymous translation of 1908 reproduced. So
interesting.
So it was a theft or who knows what.
Full of intrigue, right? Dana is wondering if it's mainly Wonderland that is translated or both the Alice books equally. Do you see a lot more Wonderland than Looking Glass?
Many more Wonderlands, I think, than the Through the Looking Glass, but Justine probably has a firmer number on that.
Yeah, I do have the stats somewhere, and I need to pull up my notes in order to find that out. But I want to say the ratio must be something like 2 to 1, if not
that many. 1. Yeah, interesting. All right, Ryan Armstrong, which I knew he was just like loving this session. He did a presentation on nonsense words and nonce formation in the Alice books about a year ago. So I knew he was going to be here and would love this. And he's got some great questions here. I love Robert Scott's German translation of Jabberwocky, which implements many of the same techniques that Dr. Kibbee discusses. For both of you, do French translations that represent grammatical irregularities sound like different books than French translations that clean them up? The irregular grammar feels integral to the English versions. Hope I did an okay reading of that it's clear. Justine, I see you nodding. Do you want to?
Yeah, I think as I mentioned, a number of translators, not a huge number, but some translators didn't make any mistake, which sort of seems like a very odd choice, frankly, especially given the second half of the sentence. But others in other parts of the book, it's clear that translators make an effort to match some kind of mistake with the English mistake, but each language has its own categories of mistakes, and it's hard to match them up one to one.
Anything to add, Justine?
Yeah, there's also the matter of the norms of translation, like the rules that guide how a text should be translated change over time. And if you look into children's literature, it is not rare to see children's books where intentional mistakes have been corrected by the translator, and it was maybe not even the translator's choice there, but the publisher's choice to have something that would be more correct in order to give a good example of good language to the children. If you look at the catalogs of the publishers in the 30s, for example, they read like manifestos of the good things that books are supposed to inspire to children. So I feel that sometimes glossing over a grammatical mistake might have been a deliberate action and not just that the translators hadn't perceived that there was a mistake.
And I want to thank you both so much. I know so many people were looking forward to this presentation, and you're both just exquisite the way you impart this information to us. It was just effortless from both of you. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And thank you all for attending.
It wasn't effortless, I'd say.
Well, you made it look effortless, and that's the important thing. And by the way, everyone, Justine is very under the weather, so she did not show that at all during her presentation. We very much appreciate her being a trooper and showing up. And I will see you all, hopefully, a few minutes at Social Hour. Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.